Hey everybody, it is well past time that I put this video out. This movie is quickly vanishing into obscurity until award season, I guess, so I really wanted to get this out earlier, but with preparations for my last video and then of course all the baby stuff going on, it's been kind of hard to get in front of the camera. But here I am. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I thought about the movie. It's right inside my wheelhouse, so a lot of you can probably guess what I thought about it. So yeah, this is my review of Oppenheimer. Oh, and then one last little housekeeping thing before I continue. Because of the baby, my old recording space is now a nursery, so this is being recorded in my bedroom, which is bigger and it has vaulted ceilings, so if the audio sounds a little bit more live than normal, we're still working on it, trying to get everything soundproofed, but I think it should be comparable to what it was before. But anyway, here we go. In 1939, physicist Leo Szilard penned a letter to then-President Franklin Roosevelt, in which he outlined a terrible danger the world was potentially facing. The Nazis were attempting to harness the power of atomic energy with intent to build a bomb. This letter was signed by Albert Einstein for some added star power and sent to Roosevelt's office with a recommendation that the Allies begin working earnestly on their own atomic program. Despite the relatively esoteric nature of atomic science during that day, the idea for an atomic bomb was nothing new. But there was a lot of research left to be done before a weapon could be realized. Some scientists were pondering this question already, but with the letter from Szilard, a fire was lit in the American War Department, and by 1942, a government initiative was formed with the express purpose of beating the Germans to the atomic bomb. The endeavor was named the Manhattan Project, and its leader was then Colonel Leslie Groves. Groves was a begrudging leader of the project who would have rather have been given an overseas deployment during the war, but he took the assignment along with a promotion, and that was that. Groves, now a brigadier general, took the task head on, acquiring factory space, personnel, and materials at a ravenous pace, all at the expense of the War Department. But Groves was not going to be able to complete this goal without scientists, a class of people which Groves was not unfamiliar with, but for whom he had very little patience for. Groves needed someone to lead the research and development section of the project. He needed a scientist, and the man he would eventually choose was J. Robert Oppenheimer. This movie is all about the man, Robert Oppenheimer, starting with his early education in England in the 1920s and leading all the way up to his scandalous fall from grace in 1954, plus a little extra for dramatic flair. This epic timeline is tackled with Nolan's signature non-linear approach, with much of the latter happenings of Oppenheimer's life being used as a framing device to tell the story of the bomb. The film seeks to portray much more than just a brilliant scientist with a dubious destiny, but rather a complex man who faced a terrible responsibility and made his decisions with full knowledge of the historical consequences. Cillian Murphy portrays the titular scientist, lending a dedicated and faithful performance to the role. Murphy lost weight to better resemble the man. He matches his mannerisms and speech patterns very convincingly, and I don't think it'd be a stretch to say he really carries the film. Through his performance, we watch Oppenheimer go from a bright-eyed, ambitiously imaginative scientist to a haunted activist with a dark and terrible vision of the future. The film outlines his early pedigree in physics, his lukewarm relationship with American communism, and his struggle with accepting his role as leader of the Manhattan Project, despite his full knowledge of the potential consequences. We get to witness his dealings with Leslie Groves, Louis Strauss, Edward Teller, and even Albert Einstein, and we also get to peer into his life as a philandering, cheating womanizer with little care for his personal dealings. In the end, the viewer is left with a wide-spanning view of one man, the man that happened to father the atomic bomb. The sections of the film that deal directly with the Manhattan Project are incredibly engaging, and it almost goes without saying that the detonation scene is awe-inspiring. And in an IMAX theater that was totally packed, I could have heard a pin drop as the flashing images blazed on the screen. The aftermath of the Trinity detonation is a bit harder to get through, but it is nonetheless very well done. We get to see how the Manhattan Project personnel react to the news about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and even how Oppenheimer helped Secretary Stimson select the targets from a list of potential cities. The whole film is a history nerd's delight, and you can tell that Nolan put great care into the accuracy of the events he presents us with. The end of the film is rather poetically brilliant in my opinion, and though I can't really call it a spoiler, I'll refrain from describing the end until later. Suffice it to say, if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend you do. Although, I guess you've kind of lost your chance if you're hearing this by now, because it's probably not in theaters or in IMAX anymore. So just watch it when it comes out. Get it on Blu-ray or 4K, or I guess stream it. Before I get into my critique, I want to make it clear that I have not yet done a full study of either Oppenheimer or the Manhattan Project, though I have gleaned more than a little peripheral knowledge from my other research, and I have a general understanding of what went down and how. Most of this section is going to be about the film itself, and not a nitpicking analysis of the historical accuracy. As you've probably gleaned by now, I really liked this movie. It was pretty much made for nerds like me, and my wife can tell you how much I lit up when atomic historical figures showed up on the screen. It definitely had its faults, and I'll get into those here, but all in all, I think it was a brilliant historical epic that every one of my viewers ought to see. So far, it seems the most common critiques I've read have to do with sound mixing and Nolan's sense of framing and style, and I can definitely see how the sound could bother somebody. The sweeping score is one of my absolute favorite parts of this movie, with Nolan abandoning Hans Blah Zimmer for Swedish composer Ludwig Göransson, who also worked on Nolan's last film, Tenet. Göransson put a lot of emphasis on strings for this score, particularly the violin, with its unparalleled dynamic and emotional range. As a musician myself, I really appreciated the prominence given to the score, but with that prominence came a bit of overbearing, you might say. Oftentimes, dialogue-heavy scenes are all but drowned by the voluminous orchestra, and more than once I found myself all but missing some key lines.
Vital importance that these matters be attended to.
But again, the score is so effective for the majority of the movie that I was more than willing to let it slide. As for Nolan's style, I think that the problem is a combination of the relative failure of his last movie Tenet, coupled with the lofty expectations that he has garnered for himself with his past films. He's sort of saddled himself with high expectations and even a little bit of fatigue. There seems to be a trend amongst highly style-driven directors to really lean into their niche, and Nolan seems to be no different. His movies tend to have fairly dry, to-the-point yet somehow prattling dialogue, surrounded by striking visuals, all tied together with a non-linear, often leaping timeline. These cliches are so prevalent that many amateur critics like myself have taken to mocking Nolan for it, and it seems like many of the more contrarian viewers out there are seizing the opportunity to build up their critical reputations by doubling down on this criticism. And who am I to say that they're wrong? I could easily see how one could get sick of Nolan's trademarks, and I have no small amount of annoyance when other directors fall into that same trap. However, I believe that the dry delivery in this film is probably more true to life than screaming matches amongst genius-level scientists might have been. And I think it is extremely disingenuous when online critics call this movie completely emotionless. There is a scene in the movie where Oppenheimer is delivering a speech to the Los Alamos faculty after the news of the Hiroshima bombing broke. Oppenheimer is trying desperately to appear patriotic and happy about the news, all the while struggling to hide his horror at what he and his colleagues had wrought. The depth of emotion from Murphy, coupled with the ravenous cheers from the crowd, was enough to make me visibly uncomfortable, and this is just one scene. Much of the dialogue is dry, and that's because that's likely how it would have been. These were scientists and military men, not reality TV stars. One of the most striking things I've discovered after researching major high-stress events is that people don't get as emotional as we might expect, and certainly not to the degree portrayed in media. That said, movies would be pretty boring without some drama, so I get why people might not prefer Nolan's character writing. I just don't think this movie is devoid of emotion to any degree close to how it's been described. The last common criticism I'll address is the lack of content in the film, or things that Nolan left out that some people have complained about. Firstly, this movie is not about the physics of nuclear fission. The movie gives a cursory and pedestrian explanation of some of the concepts involved, but in large part, it leaves the science to dialogue that progresses the story. Some have maligned Nolan for not including more of the physics in his film, and speaking as someone who is fairly interested in the topic, thank God he didn't. Again, this movie is about Oppenheimer, the man, and while it is important to establish his background in physics, which the movie does quite thoroughly, I feel it would be extremely distracting to have a 30-minute soliloquy explaining the intricacies of a nuclear reaction in the middle of this character study. The next thing that was left out is the small but loud criticism that Nolan neglected to show the detonations at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that no Japanese people were featured in the film. Again, and hopefully for the last time, this film is about Oppenheimer, and he was not on the Enola Gay when it bombed Japan. His reaction to the attacks is one of the best parts of the film to me, and reveling in that terrible event would have been excessive and in poor taste, I think. Those attacks are cultural and historical monoliths for the people of Japan, and there is a wealth of media portraying the bombings and their meaning for the country. You just have to look to Japan to find it, exactly where it should be. Okay, so that's enough playing defense. Time to talk a little bit about what I didn't like as much. Firstly, there are a lot of names in this movie, and if you're like me, that might not have been a problem. Thankfully, I had peripheral knowledge of most of the characters named, but if I hadn't, it would have been pretty tough to keep all the names straight. And speaking of characters, I think it was an interesting choice on Nolan's part to portray Groves as such an amicable guy in the story. From what I've read, he was widely regarded as a huge ass amongst the scientific community. Now, don't get me wrong, Nolan does portray the conflicts between Groves and the scientists, especially surrounding the concept of compartmentalization, but at times, it seems like he and Oppenheimer were buddies.
You and he were buddies, weren't you?
Portraying Groves in a fairly sympathetic light. I don't know, maybe they did have a good relationship while working, but nearly everything I've read about Groves paints a picture of a megalomaniacal narcissist with little patience for science. But I just put his personal account of these events in my reading list, so maybe I can round out my view of the man a little better when I finish it. Next, it is quite obvious after a time who the villain of the film is, and quick spoiler alert. It's Lewis Strauss, AEC chairman and presidential cabinet nominee. After some cursory research, it is clear that Strauss and Oppenheimer did have problems, and very little of the substantive content of the film seems disingenuous. So my only real critique is just how cartoonish Strauss appears. I think Robert Downey Jr. does a fine job for the most part, and it's more the position of his character than anything he contributed. I don't know, I guess a film needs a villain, and Strauss was a good fit. It just felt a little weird to me. I suppose I should do a full study on Strauss and that period and make up my mind after that. And one more thing while I'm thinking about it, I did mention that I thought that the detonation scene was really, amazing and awe-inspiring, and I think that Nolan used mostly practical effects to make it happen, which I think is really incredible. But I will say, it did feel just a tiny bit small. And while I'm almost always a practical effects over CGI guy, I think they could have maybe made the whole thing seem bigger had they used CGI, kind of like Twin Peaks: The Return, if any of you've ever seen that. Lynch does a really good job of making that bomb feel enormous. And the Trinity explosion, for those of you who don't know, was actually bigger than Fat Man and Little Boy. So I feel like maybe if they had used just a tiny bit of CGI, they could have really made it seem huge, and then it would have been perfect. But, it was still amazing. I could probably think of other rubs if I tried, and I will mention again the former critiques involving the score and labyrinthian storyboarding, but all of my criticisms do nothing to detract from the monumental achievement this film represents: a sweeping historical drama about the man who fathered the atomic bomb. The fact that this movie did so well makes me hopeful that more of us can remember the extreme importance of nuclear power, and maybe spark further interest in the fascinating history surrounding atomic weapons. Now for that sort of spoiler. The last act of the movie is all about Oppenheimer battling against allegations that he was a communist sympathizer who couldn't be trusted with security clearance. We spent the whole movie hinting at this issue, but after the bomb is built and after the attacks on Japan, there's really nothing else left. The battle of personalities that takes place between Oppenheimer and Strauss is the main focus, with the paranoia coming from the latter driving much of the drama. In the first act, Strauss is seen approaching Oppenheimer as he finishes a discussion with Albert Einstein. The legendary physicist walks by Strauss without even acknowledging him, leading the man to believe that Oppenheimer had poisoned the old scientist against him. This happening is like a rosebud moment in the movie, with the final callback occurring right at the end. The whole time, Strauss assumed that Oppenheimer had said something about him. The drama had taken over his entire perspective, blinding him to the gravity of the events around them. Just like us, Strauss forgot the point of the movie, and Oppenheimer then reveals why Einstein couldn't look at Strauss. Oppenheimer reminds us what the whole point was. To this end, I suppose the position of Strauss in the film is justified, historical accuracy notwithstanding. He is us, distracted and obsessed by meaningless egoism and drama in the face of the world-bending events happening all around us. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching my second Doom to Rewind video, and apologies again that it has taken me so long to put out another one. The pending arrival of my daughter in December has been so fun and exciting for me and my wife, but unfortunately it has meant that I've had much less time to put towards videos. I work 2 jobs in addition to trying to research all of this stuff, so it can be really difficult to find the time, but I definitely do not plan on stopping. I want to continue to make these for as long as I can, just like I said in the last one. I've got another Broken Arrow coming down the pipeline probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks. I've got the outline done, the research is done, so I just need to write it, film it, and edit it, and then we'll have another one, so that'll be great. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it influences you to go out and watch Oppenheimer whenever it comes out in whatever way you can. It really was an incredible movie and an amazing subject. I highly recommend you do your own reading and research on the Manhattan Project, because it really was one of the most incredible scientific feats of you know, the 20th century. So anyway, that's it, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one, and thanks a lot.